Welcome to English Stories for Listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you genuinely want to be fluent in English.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you a story about how I learned to speak English with students in a classroom. When I first started teaching, I was very nervous. I didn't know how to connect with the students. I didn't know if I could speak English well enough for them to understand me. Every night I would sit by my desk, staring at my notes, thinking, will they listen to me? Will they learn from me? One morning I walked into my classroom, my hands shaking. The students were sitting in their seats, looking at me, waiting. My heart raced and I could hardly breathe. But I knew I had to try, so I took a deep breath and started talking. At first it felt like my words were stuck inside me, but I remembered something my mother used to say: the best way to speak is from the heart, so I told the students a little story about my own struggles with English. I shared how, as a little girl, I would sit by the window in our small house, watching the rain fall, dreaming of speaking English like the people I saw on TV. It wasn't easy. I made many mistakes, but I never gave up. The students listened closely, and I saw their eyes light up. That day something changed. I realized that teaching English wasn't just about grammar or vocabulary. It was about connecting with the students, understanding their struggles, and showing them that they could overcome anything if they believed in themselves. One of the students, a shy boy named Michael, always sat at the back of the class. He never raised his hand, and he barely spoke a word of English. I could see the fear in his eyes. It reminded me of myself when I was younger, scared to speak because I didn't want to make a mistake. So one day I asked him to stay after class. We sat together, and I told him, it's okay to be afraid, but you are stronger than your fear. I shared with him how, when I was learning English, I would practice in front of the mirror, talking to myself, pretending I was speaking to someone else. At first it felt silly, but with time it gave me confidence. Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. I'm afraid people will laugh at me, he whispered. I nodded, understanding his pain. I used to feel the same way, I said. But every time someone laughed, I remembered that their laughter didn't define me. What defined me was my courage to keep going. From that day on, Michael started participating more in class. He wasn't perfect, and sometimes he stumbled over his words, but he kept trying. And with every mistake, he grew stronger. His classmates began to notice, and soon they were encouraging each other. The classroom became a place where everyone felt safe to speak, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. As the weeks went by, I saw my students grow in ways I had never imagined. They were no longer just learning English, they were finding their voices. And in finding their voices, they were discovering who they were. One day, a student named Emily stood up in class and shared a story about her family. Her father had lost his job, and her mother was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Emily said that learning English was hard for her because she didn't have much time to study. But then she said something that touched my heart deeply. She said, "When I come to this classroom, I feel like I can breathe. I feel like I can be myself." Her words brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, I realized that teaching English wasn't just about language. It was about giving students a space where they could feel seen, heard, and valued. It was about showing them that no matter what challenges they faced, they were capable of achieving great things. Over time, the classroom became more than just a place to learn. It became a community, a family. We laughed together, we cried together, and we supported each other through every struggle. One of the most memorable moments came when a student named John, who had been struggling with English for months, finally stood up and gave a speech in front of the class. His hands were shaking, and his voice was soft, but he spoke with courage. When he finished, the entire class erupted in applause. John looked at me, his eyes filled with pride, and I knew that he had found his voice. Teaching English has taught me so much about life. It's taught me that every person has a story, and that story is worth sharing. It's taught me that the most important thing we can do as teachers is to create a space where students feel safe to be themselves. And it's taught me that, no matter how difficult the journey may be, there is always hope. Every day, I remind my students of one simple truth: your voice matters. I tell them that no matter how many mistakes they make, they are learning, growing, and becoming stronger. And I remind them that, just like I once struggled with English, they too will overcome their challenges. There's a quote I love to share with my students: "The only way to fail is to stop trying." I tell them that as long as they keep trying, they will never truly fail. They may stumble, they may fall, but each time they get back up, they are one step closer to success. I remember a time when I almost gave up on teaching. It was during my first year, and I felt like I wasn't making any difference. The students didn't seem to be improving, and I began to doubt myself. I would sit in my car after school, crying, wondering if I was cut out for this. But then, one day, a student came up to me after class and handed me a small note. It said, "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." That note changed everything for me. It reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place: not to be perfect, but to make a difference in the lives of my students. From that day on, I made a promise to myself that I would never give up on my students, no matter how hard things got, and I would never let them give up on themselves. I would be there to remind them, every step of the way, that they were capable of achieving greatness. As I look back on my journey, I am filled with gratitude. Teaching English has been one of the greatest joys of my life. It has allowed me to connect with so many incredible students, each with their own unique story. And it has shown me the power of resilience, determination, and hope. To anyone who is struggling to learn English, I want to say this: you are not alone. I know it can be hard, and I know it can feel overwhelming at times. But remember, every step you take is a step forward. Every word you speak, no matter how imperfect, is a victory. And to all the teachers out there, I want to say this: never underestimate the impact you can have on a student's life. Every word of encouragement, every smile, every moment of patience, it all makes a difference. As I continue to teach, I carry with me the lessons I've learned along the way. And I hope that, in some small way, I can continue to make a difference in the lives of my students. But this story isn't over. There are still so many students to teach, so many voices to help find their way, and I am ready for whatever comes next. One day, a new student walked into my classroom. Her name was Jessica, and she looked scared and lost, just like I had been when I first started teaching. Jessica didn't speak much English. She sat quietly in the corner of the room, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I could feel the weight of her fear. It reminded me of the days when I used to sit in a classroom, afraid to speak up, worried that everyone would judge me if I made a mistake. After class, I went up to Jessica and gently asked her how she was feeling. She looked down, her eyes filled with tears, and said in a soft voice, "I don't belong here. I don't know anything." My heart ached for her. I remembered the times I felt the same way. But I knew that this was the moment she needed to hear the truth, that she did belong, that she was enough. I sat beside her and told her, "I know it feels hard right now, but you're stronger than you think. You don't have to know everything. You just have to be willing to try." Jessica looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, as if no one had ever told her those words before. I told her a story about when I was a teenager, just starting to learn English. I had gone to a store one day to buy something small, but when I tried to ask for help, the words wouldn't come out. I was so nervous that I could barely speak. The shopkeeper looked at me with confusion, and I felt so embarrassed that I ran out of the store without saying another word. For days I avoided speaking to anyone in English. I was afraid of making a fool of myself. But one night my mother sat me down and said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep going." Those words stayed with me, and slowly I started speaking again, little by little, word by word. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Jessica smiled through her tears. I could see a spark of hope in her eyes. From that day on, she started coming to class with a little more confidence. She made mistakes, of course, but she didn't let them hold her back. She tried, and that was what mattered most. Over time, I saw Jessica transform. She began raising her hand in class, asking questions, and even helping her classmates. One day, she stood in front of the class and read a short story in English. Her voice trembled, but she made it through, and the entire class clapped for her. She looked at me, her face glowing with pride, and I knew that she had found her voice. Moments like these are what make teaching so special. It's not about the perfect lesson plans or the textbooks. It's about seeing the growth in each student, watching them overcome their fears, and helping them realize that they are capable of so much more than they ever imagined. As the months passed, I became more comfortable with my role as a teacher. I learned that speaking English in the classroom wasn't just about grammar rules or pronunciation. It was about creating an environment where students felt safe to express themselves, to make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes without fear of judgment. One day, I decided to try something different with my students. Instead of the usual lesson, I asked them to share a story from their own lives. At first, they were hesitant. Speaking about personal experiences in English was intimidating for many of them. But I assured them that this was a safe space where no one would judge them. One by one, the students began to share. A boy named Alex talked about how his family had moved to the US when he was only 7 years old. He didn't speak a word of English back then, and he remembered feeling like an outsider at school. I used to sit alone at lunch, he said, because I didn't know how to ask anyone to sit with me. Another student, Maria, spoke about how her parents worked long hours just to provide for the family. Sometimes she said, her voice shaking, "I feel guilty because I'm not helping enough. Learning English is hard, but I know it's important. I want to make my parents proud." Listening to their stories, I realized something powerful. Learning English wasn't just an academic challenge for these students. It was deeply connected to their identities, their families, their hopes, and their dreams. Every word they learned was a step toward a better future, not just for themselves, but for the people they loved. One of the most moving stories came from a girl named Grace. She had always been quiet in class, but that day she spoke up. She told us about her father, who had passed away the year before. He had always dreamed of her becoming fluent in English because he believed it would open doors for her. Every time I struggle with a word, Grace said, I hear his voice telling me to keep going. That's why I'm here. By the time Grace finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Her story touched all of us, and it reminded me, once again, of the incredible strength and resilience my students carried within them. After that day, something shifted in the classroom. The students began to see each other not just as classmates, but as a community. They started helping one another more, sharing their own tips and tricks for learning English. The classroom became a place of trust, where everyone supported each other's growth. One afternoon, I received an email from the mother of a student named David. She told me that David had always struggled in school, especially with English, and that he had often come home frustrated. But lately, she had noticed a change in him. He was more confident, more willing to try, even when things were difficult. He told me it's because of you, she wrote. He says you make him believe he can do it. Reading that email, I felt a surge of emotion. It's moments like these that make all the struggles of teaching worthwhile. Knowing that I could make a difference in a student's life, even in a small way, filled me with a deep sense of purpose. But it wasn't always easy. There were still days when the challenges seemed overwhelming. Sometimes I doubted whether I was doing enough, whether I was really helping my students as much as I wanted to. But every time I felt that doubt creeping in, I reminded myself of something important. Teaching, like learning, is a journey. And as long as I kept trying, kept showing up for my students, I was making a difference. One of the things I've learned over the years is that the most important lessons in the classroom aren't found in textbooks. They're found in the connections we make with each other. They're found in the stories we share, in the courage it takes to speak up, and in the strength it takes to keep going, even when things are hard. There's a quote I often share with my students: success is not the absence of failure, it's the persistence through failure. I remind them that every mistake they make is a step towards success, not away from it. I tell them that the only way to truly fail is to stop trying, and as long as they keep trying, they are succeeding. One evening, as I was grading papers, I came across an essay from a student named Ethan. He had always been a quiet presence in the classroom, rarely speaking unless called on. But in his essay, he wrote about how learning English had changed his life. At first, I didn't think I could do it, he wrote. But then I realized that English wasn't just a subject. It was a way to connect with people, to understand the world around me, and to share my own story. Now, when I speak English, I feel like I'm finally being heard. Those words stayed with me. They reminded me why I had chosen to become a teacher in the first place. It wasn't just about teaching a language, it was about helping my students find their voices and giving them the tools to express who they are and what they believe in. As the school year continued, I saw my students grow in ways that filled me with pride. They weren't just improving their English skills, they were becoming more confident, more compassionate, and more resilient. They were learning not just how to speak English, but how to navigate the world with courage and determination. There was one student named Lily who had always struggled with speaking in front of others. She would freeze up whenever she was called on in class, her face turning red with embarrassment. But over time, with gentle encouragement, she began to open up. She started participating more, asking questions, and even helping her classmates with their work. One day, Lily stood in front of the class to give a presentation. I could see the fear in her eyes, but she took a deep breath and began speaking. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she continued, it grew stronger. When she finished, the class erupted in applause. Lily beamed with pride, and I knew that she had overcome one of her greatest fears. Moments like these are what teaching is all about. It's about helping students realize their potential even when they can't see it themselves. It's about creating a space where they feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from those mistakes. I often think back to the days when I was a student, sitting in a classroom, struggling to learn English. I remember the fear, the frustration, and the doubt. But I also remember the teachers who believed in me, who encouraged me to keep going, even when I wanted to give up. They are the reason I am where I am today, and I strive every day